Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wassalatu wassalamu ala ashrafil mursaleen. Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa ashabihi ajma'een. Walhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. What I'm going to say this afternoon and in the presentation of my paper is not based on journalism, nor on some academic reports, but on direct observation of some of the events that commenced 35 to 40 years ago, as well as meeting some of the heads of state involved in these affairs in most of the Middle East countries. And therefore, this presentation, whilst it's not an extempore presentation, it's going to be strictly on script, and therefore you will pardon me if I read it out. As I've said some 35 years ago, Muslim Mujahideen in Afghanistan served as an US armed proxy against the Soviet Union. This was in pursuit of the grand chess game conceived by the US Zionist Brzezinski and the well-known and controversial Henry Kissinger in the Cold War struggle against the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union's subsequent collapse gave the West the unexpected victory over the Communist empire. The collapse of the Berlin Wall that followed paved the way for the reunification of Germany and the formation of the European Union. For the US, it emboldened the Zionist Jewish neoconservatives to forge a unipolar world order. And the US, as a proxy of the Zionist state of Israel and its criminal expansionist designs in the Middle East. For the Muslim Mujahideen, who gave their blood and lives for the struggle against the Soviet Union and the freedom of Europe, the reward from their former masters was exile, to be murdered en masse by the US-led special forces and helicopter gunships, and we noted that Muslim Somalia was destroyed. These, or those Mujahideen that managed to flee, sought revenge against the US-led treachery, and though they were disparate, stateless, and without arms, they were named Al-Qaeda by the US and its allies for propaganda purposes and pursued into Afghanistan and Pakistan to be eliminated by drone attacks. The US and its Zionist allies murdered thousands of innocent Muslim civilians and rendered millions injured and homeless. The Zionist-US alliance thereafter, following the 9/11 event, which brings us more to recent times, found it convenient to use the Al-Qaeda phantom name as an excuse to invade Iraq and remove it from any possible threat to the criminal ambitions of Israel. On the successful removal of Saddam Hussein and the total destruction of Iraq as a viable state, US Zionist ambitions spread to the destruction of Muslim Libya, the Muslim Arab Spring of Egypt, and eventually for regime change and destruction of mainly Muslim Syria as a viable state. The next target is Muslim Iran, with incitement to sow division and discord between Sunni Muslims and Shia Muslims. In Syria, we note that the major Western objective of inciting, sponsoring, and advancing a contrived Sunni revolt against Hafiz Assad's Alawite regime was to cut off Tehran, direct access land through Iraq and Syria to Lebanon and to Hezbollah, the only remaining credible and direct military resistance to Zionist Israel. However, the ensuing attempt at regime change in Syria saw the resurrection by the same US elements of the ghost of Al-Qaeda as a proxy rebranded as ISIS. To provide cover for further attacks, regime change, and to demonize Islam and Muslims so that Western acts of murder, genocides, war crimes, and wholesale destruction of cities and infrastructure escape accountability to the international community of nations. ISIS is therefore a Western Zionist Israeli intelligence-driven false flag, aided by vile individuals, mercenaries and collectives, including the 1% banksters of Wall Street, academic terrorists in sheep clothing such as the sinister inspirer of global Islamophobia, Bernard Henry Lewis, and the controversial and alleged war criminal Henry Kissinger, and the army of neoconservative US mercenaries, including crypto-Zionists like the proxy tribes of the oil-rich states feigning to be Muslims, while methodically discrediting Islam and attempting to destroy it from within. ISIS deliberately calls itself Islamic or Islamist, since the purpose is to discredit Muslims, destroy historical evidence, archaeological sites, infrastructure, schools, colleges, hospitals, and libraries, whether in Mali, Libya, Somalia, Iraq, Syria, Palestine, or the targeted Gulf states. In doing so, it is self-evident that it can never be Islamic. Neither has it resisted any Zionist actions and the criminal occupation of Palestinian lands. There is nothing about it that is Islamic, both in aim and objectives. It is in fact a US Zionist snake that warrants the strongest condemnation, and of its sponsors as well. For South African civilians and organizations to be associated with it in any manner or form, I say without hesitation, is criminal. So is support of Zionism, once regarded by the UN as a crime against humanity. The fact that the ISIS formation support and sustainability has been provided by covert means by almost all the intelligence services of the Western powers, Muslim organizations of South Africa are, in my respectful view, largely ignorant of the geopolitical affairs and are therefore highly vulnerable to such Western-led ISIS propaganda. The fall of Aleppo fully exposed the plot of the US and its allies. Zionist handlers embedded in ISIS as fake jihadis continue to lure the most vulnerable and the most ignorant from Western countries in Africa under the pretext that they are fighting for the survival of Islam. These false flag operations, whilst ostensibly serving to alienate European societies from Islam and Muslims, are actually intended to benefit Israel in its diabolical and criminal plan to colonize large parts of Palestinian lands and to maintain continued hegemony in the heartlands of Islam by initiating and regulating a state of controlled chaos in the surrounding Muslim states. With few exceptions, many ulama in South Africa, as well as Muslim organizations, atrociously ignorant of such developments, do not deal with this potentially dangerous and destabilizing problem, not only for the world of Islam, but for the Muslim community of South Africa as well. I'm pleased to say when Maulana Rawat mentioned about the ulama and their meeting, that it is a breath of fresh air that some consideration is coming onto the agenda. Concerning the mitigation of his political theology, firstly, to mitigate the diabolical objectives of ISIS, the ulama and the layperson need to be educated and thoroughly informed of the true nature of the geopolitical affairs and the chess game played by the Western powers. By harping on a Zionist-contrived Sunni and Shia conflict, they are, in my respectful view, inadvertently advancing the criminal agenda of global Zionism. Secondly, further mitigation will be achieved if the ANC government or ANC-led government seriously institutes criminal proceedings against any South African citizen, regardless of religion, language, race, or political affiliation, who engages in actions that support this vile Zionist-sponsored proxy for the greater interests of South African peace, civic society, and social stability. Thirdly, in the same way that Zionist corporate funds have captured the US Senate, the Congress, and the security cluster to its interests, to the financial loss and detriment of the US citizenry, a similar pattern is emerging in South Africa, with some of the local parties, particularly in the opposition, and the smaller parties already showing perceptions of being captured. Large religious groups of the citizenry naively believing Zionist propaganda that they are the Lost 13 tribe will further add to this capture and the potential destabilization of South African civic society. That Israeli security officers have a free hand at OR Tambo International not only impugns the sovereignty of South Africa, but also presents a very high risk for classic false flags. A false flag operation involving a naive or disgruntled Muslim pretender or revert among the many nationalities that are refugees in South Africa. In my view, the greatest single danger to South Africa lies not in such refugees, but in such officials currently roaming unchecked at our busiest international airports at Cape Town and Johannesburg. The South African security services should handle such matters themselves with the utmost vigilance and not leave airport security to a highly suspect third party. It is also significant that the genesis of almost all terrorist operations in Europe involving ingress or egress from the airports are handled by companies associated with the Israeli security services. This alone is sufficient to raise a red flag. It is not a question of if, but when, for such similar events to occur in South Africa. Shukran. Wassalamu alaikum.